computer. All right, so the recording's now in progress, and I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll get started. Okay, so before we actually begin with the presentation, I just wanted to mention that, so if you have questions or anything throughout the talk, I'd actually prefer this to be like more of a dialogue. So if you have direct questions or comments or anything like that, I would much rather, talk in the moment than have you wait till afterwards. So the point of, or the topic of today's talk is Venus Through the Ages, a brief introduction. So I just wanted to mention why it is that I'm talking about this. So I am a Camillus right now in the CP, and my deity of choice is Venus. So I've been doing a bunch of research, most of which is actually not in this presentation, but I wanted to provide, kind of a general overview of the goddess and where she comes from, because it is a really long history, and it is also something that is interesting from the standpoint of us as a Sodalitas of barbarians. So because she really does not come from the Roman world originally. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started, and we'll walk through this. So the outline for today, so we'll begin with the Mesopotamian origins, and then we'll move through the Phoenician and the Greek periods into Rome, and then from there we'll talk a little bit speculatively about some other ways in which she might crop up, particularly in Germanic cultures. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some common themes. So let's begin with the beginning, more or less, at least as far as we can tell. So actually, before I get too deep into it, can people see everything on the screen pretty well? Okay, cool. So I want to begin with the Mesopotamian origins of Venus, which is ultimately coming from two sources. So the first one would be the Sumerians. So the Sumerian period is very, very old. We're talking a little bit less than 4000 BCE as the initiation of this civilization in what today would be southern Iraq, in the kind of marshy areas. And so as you may or may not be aware, so the Sumerians are one of the earliest, if not the earliest, origins of writing, and they used cuneiform as one of their writing systems. So this was writing on clay with a stylus. So what I have shown here in the upper right-hand corner, or sorry, upper left-hand corner, is the earliest naming of Venus, which would be Inanna. So in Sumerian, as well as in Akkadian, which came after it, they have both determinatives, which are signs that are symbolic for some kind of quality. So in this case, this sign, this first one is for a deity, and the second one is her actual name, which is Inanna. So you wouldn't read both of them, but you would just read the second one. And the other thing to know about culturally is that, so eventually the Sumerians were overtaken by their rivals to the north, who were the Akkadians in general. So this is broken down into Babylon as well as into Assyria. And there's, it's an extremely broad range of time periods. So we're going from, the 3000s-ish BCE all the way up until like the 700s BCE. So that's from Old Babylonian all the way through the Neo-Assyrian periods. And so it's a really long stretch of time to be making any sorts of discussion about and making any sort of generalizations about. But the primary thing is that, at least from a linguistic standpoint, so Sumerian is a language isolate that died out, but Akkadian is the first known Semitic language, the first recorded Semitic language. And it is an Eastern Semitic language. So In terms of Inanna herself, or Ishtar herself, so Ishtar is the way that the Akkadians would have referred to her. So she was a goddess of love and beauty and sex, as well as war and divine justice and the healing of the sick. So there are lots and lots of prayers to Ishtar specifically for healing of people. And in particular, so in kind of a divine justice-y sort of way. So one of the most recent things that I was reading discussed uh, how if somebody believed that they were being that they were sick because somebody else had cast a curse on them. So you could pray to Inanna as well as her husband Dumuzi, who's also named Tammuz, in order to avenge you and make the evildoer kind of go away. So in terms of iconography, a couple of the primary things are the 8-pointed star, which you see a picture of here kind of in the middle of the screen, which is a representation literally of the planet Venus. So the Babylonians, as well as the Assyrians after them and the Sumerians before them, considered the planets to have something to do with the gods and goddesses. Not necessarily that they were actually them themselves, but they were associated with them. And it's kind of muddy. We don't know for sure how exactly they were related, but when it comes to astrology, which is also very big in this area of the world, the planet Venus is directly associated with Ishtar. So she is also associated with some different animals, in particular lions and doves. So actually, if you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, so Ishtar is either riding or taming a lion, and you can see that also that she has wings. She's also deeply associated with magic, and in particular with magic jewelry. So there is a famous story. It's one of the primary stories about Ishtar, which is in which she descends into the underworld to rescue her husband Dumuzi from the underworld. So when she does this, she's compelled to take off a piece of jewelry at each of these 7 gates, or 7 or 9 gates, I don't remember, that she has to walk through. And as she takes off a piece of jewelry, she's losing some kind of magic along the way. And also by the end of it, she's not wearing any clothes, which is a kind of a hint to the kind of sexual nature of her as a goddess as well. Another interesting thing is that she has a twin brother. So her twin brother is the sun god Shamash, also called Utu. All right. So any questions or comments before we move on? Okay, so if not, so as we move forward in history, so we move into the period of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And so there's a picture in the lower right-hand corner of kind of the area of the world that we're talking about. This is northwest of Babylonia. So obviously these cultures were going on at the same time, right? And there was a lot of intense interaction between these cultures. And as either as a result of that or for other reasons that are unexplained, the goddess as well shows up in Canaanite and Phoenician culture. So here she was called Ashtart. And if you take a look, so if you remind you, so the Akkadian for Ishtar is Asdartu, which is rendered in Canaanite or Phoenician as Ashtart. So it is extremely likely that these two are at least related. So she was also like the Babylonians called the Queen of Heaven, and she was a patron deity of war and divine justice and healing. But interestingly, in Phoenician culture, she was much more associated with hunting, so similar to Artemis or Diana, and a little bit less towards the love and beauty and sex aspects. So her iconography in terms of animals was also very similar to that in ancient Mesopotamia, so things like doves, lions, but also because she was a huntress, things like the crescent moon and horses and chariots. So the thing about the Phoenicians is that they were a seafaring people. So they were trading all around the Mediterranean, and they created trading posts all around, so as far away as Spain. And as a result, so this cult statue, which you see in the upper right-hand corner, was actually recovered from Spain. It's called the Lady of Galera, and it is hypothesized that this is actually an image of Astarte. So how do we get from here to ultimately Venus? Well, there's kind of the next stepping stone. So if you see in the picture, to get from ancient Phoenicia to Cyprus is just a hop, skip, and a jump on a boat. So it is
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Regarding the Phoenician
Mhm.
Astarte, were there differences between, for instance, the Eastern and the Western Mediterranean area? Because, I mean, the Phoenician civilization lived on for hundreds of thousands of years. And I
Yeah,
mean, there were some minor differences in terms of culture and a few other things between, for instance, Lebanon, like the Phoenicians in Lebanon, as you know, in Carthage. So, I mean, did she evolve over time in the Phoenician civilization?
I could only imagine that that is the case. Yes. And I would assume that, so one of the other common themes, and this is, something that's common to, I think, all gods and goddesses that kind of move around, is that they get kind of assimilated also to native deities. So, if there is already a native culture that has something kind of similar, often they will kind of pair up, and they kind of meld together into common one kind of common deity. And we see this especially with Venus herself. So when we get to the Roman aspect, I am not, I am by no means, I am by no means an expert in specifically Astarte. So it would require some extra research to be able to answer that a little bit more thoughtfully. But I would say in general, absolutely, that there is differentiation. And because, like you said, it's such a long time period, like there's bound to be change. So moving on, if we start to think about the Greek world, so it is theorized that Astarte was introduced to the Mycenaean Greeks, which is roughly, in the 1700s BCE area, and her name became Aphrodite. So there are a couple areas of Greece where she is hypothesized to have been from. So she's either born off of Cyprus or possibly also born off of Kythera. So if you can see there's an arrow which is pointing to Kythera, which is this teeny tiny little island off of the Peloponnese, in between the Peloponnese and Crete. So we see a lot of the same themes in Aphrodite that we do have in Astarte, as well as in Ishtar. However, there is also innovation or mixing or melding with other gods or with other goddesses. So similarly, she also has a celestial kind of aspect, an Aphrodite Urania. So this is the kind of the celestial aspect, but she also has Pandemos, which means of all people. So in terms of her patronage, this is again love and beauty and passion and procreation and these sorts of things. And in particular, I just wanted to point out that, so there was a day of the week which is associated with her, which is Friday. So this is Hemera Aphroditis, or the day of Aphrodite. And she was still associated with the planet of Venus. And the reason why, we think, is because ultimately the native Greek astrology and astronomy was heavily influenced by the Middle East, so with their cultural contacts. So there are, however, new myths, as you would expect. So the really big important one at least from the standpoint of a Roman standpoint, would be the Iliad. So she is a central figure in the Iliad, and she's the recipient of the Golden Apple, right, from Paris. And ultimately, she also is the mother of Aeneas. One other thing that I wanted to point out is the Adonis myth. So the Adonis myth is also coming from the Middle East ultimately. And in it, so Adonis in Greek culture is a human male who is supposed to be very attractive, who she falls in love with, and ultimately dies. And so this is tenuously similar to Dumuzi, who also dies. So let's move on a little bit to the Roman Venus. So similar to the Greek Aphrodite, so the Roman Venus was assimilated probably from Greek culture plus native Roman culture. And the Romans were absolutely wild for Venus. They loved Venus, and had tons and tons of different temples to her. So you can see a few of the different cults, which are in the upper left-hand corner. So each of these is a place that has a cult statue to Venus and either a temple or an altar or something like this. And you get kind of this uniquely Roman twist with Venus in that we're not only talking about love and sex and desire in terms of like, desire for other people, but also the desire for conquest. And so we get kind of a hint again of this more warlike deity. So again, in terms of her associations, so this is the day Friday, so Dies Veneris, and the planet Venus. Some more specifically Roman stuff. So within Rome itself, there were no less than 15 different temples or ides to Venus. And she was a favorite of the first Caesar Augustus. So the reason behind this is ultimately that that Julius Caesar claimed descent from Aeneas and therefore ultimately from Venus. She was also very popular in Pompeii, and actually the image that you see in the upper right-hand corner is an image that is taken from Pompeii. So there are lots and lots of Roman-specific myths associated with Venus. So one of them is the Venus Calva myth. So this, in this case, so there is a Roman siege, or a siege of Rome, I should say, and one of the ideas is that the women of Rome, were either sacrificing or giving their hair to make bowstrings for the defense of the city. The cult of Venus Genetrix is obviously the one that is ultimately the birth of Rome, right? That is coming ultimately from Aeneas. And the third one is the Verticordia. So Verticordia means the change of hearts, and this is associated with the festival of Veneralia, which is April 1st. So she's also associated with the wine harvest, and I'm not 100% sure why this is, other than the only thing I can think is that perhaps it has to do with the name itself. So Veneralia and Vinalia, these are they sound very similar, and I'm curious whether there was some kind of association that had to do with the name itself. So the last area that I wanted to talk about was the Germanic cultures. So unlike the Roman, Greek, and other cultures, we have a lot less in terms of direct documentary evidence for this goddess in the time period when Rome was still active, and and because there was a lot less writing that was going on in the Germanic areas. It's not to say that there wasn't any, but there is the majority of when we have actually documentary evidence comes from a lot later, so significantly after the Western Roman Empire had already fallen. And this goddess is found across the Germanic world, all the way from places in Germany all the way to Iceland. So the goddess that I'm talking about is Freya, or sometimes Frigg or Frigga as well. So early on in Germanic spirituality, we don't have very much in terms of documentary evidence, and there is ongoing debate about whether or not these two goddesses are the same or different. However, the Germans themselves interpreted this goddess as Venus in sometimes, and in some particular areas. So she was a goddess also of love and sex, but also of war. And in particular, if we're talking about during the Norse period, she was associated with taking half of the dead off of the battlefield after a battle, right? And she's also associated with magic, and in particular, a particular type of magic called Scyther. So interestingly and tantalizingly, she also has magic jewelry. So the Brisingamen, which is a special necklace, as well as a feather cloak, which kind of recalls the flight of all the way back through Ishtar. She's directly associated with a day of the week, in particular Friday, which is where in English we get the word Friday. And she also, interestingly, has a twin brother, Freyr. So there are some relatively early places where she is mentioned. The earliest place where it's in a native Germanic language that is still preserved is the Merseburg Charms, of which there are only 2 of them, and she's briefly mentioned. And then there's way more in the later material in the Poetic and the Prose Eddas. So I just wanted to wrap up with some kind of general ideas about this goddess and some of the common themes. So we're talking about, in general, a goddess of love and sex, but also, almost paradoxically, war, or justice and these sorts of things, often associated with magic or flying, and as well as with jewelry. She has a common day of the week, which is Friday, and a planet that she's associated with, which is, of course, the planet Venus. In some cases, she also has a twin brother. So in more than one case, she has a twin brother, and also has a lover who is supposed to be very beautiful, who sometimes dies. So that is the end of this little presentation. So I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. So I'm going to stop sharing and also probably stop the recording.